Muy bien, muy bien, muy bien. Buenas tardes a todos, buenas tardes a todas. Les damos cordialmente la bienvenida a la segunda parte de esta sesión inaugural del workshop Faad 2021. Mi nombre es Gabriel Saldías Rosell, coordinador de investigación y académico de la Facultad de Arquitectura, Artes y Diseño, y seré su anfitrión durante esta jornada. En unos momentos comenzaremos con la charla del profesor Kenneth Frampton, titulado Regionalismo Crítico Revisitado. Aprovecho de recordarles que esta charla contará con traducción simultánea español-inglés e inglés-español, por lo que podrán escoger en qué idioma prefieren escucharla, haciendo clic en el icono de mundo que se encuentra en la zona inferior derecha de la pantalla de Zoom. In English, we will have simultaneous translation on this lecture, which you can access by clicking on the word icon on the main Zoom screen. Mientras se lleve a cabo la charla, micrófonos y cámaras permanecerán desactivados, por lo que los y las invitamos a que dejen sus preguntas por escrito en el chat de la sala para recogerlas al final y así generar un diálogo con el profesor Frampton. Sin más demora entonces, quisiera ceder la palabra a la decana de la Facultad de Arquitectura, Artes y Diseño de la Universidad Católica de Temuco, María Sándor Vallespir, para que por favor introduzca a nuestro distinguido invitado. Decana, la palabra es suya.
Muchas gracias, Gabriel. Muy buenas tardes a todas y todos. Es un honor para mí poder presentar a Kenneth Frampton. Kenneth Frampton no necesita presentación, pues es difícil encontrar una persona más universal dentro de la disciplina de la arquitectura. Arquitecto consagrado, se considera a sí mismo más escritor que crítico o historiador. Si hay alguna cualidad de Frampton que todos quienes lo conocen siempre destacan, es su generosidad. Generosidad cultural, generosidad ética, generosidad profesional y sobre todo la generosidad con la que imparte su profundo intelecto. Nuestra escuela ya ha sido testigo de esta generosidad. Conocí a Kenneth Frampton de manera virtual durante mayo de este año en la instancia de revisión de proyecto de uno de nuestros talleres en el semestre pasado. Todos esperábamos que asistiese durante un momento y luego se retirase para continuar con su apretada agenda. En vez de eso, Kenneth Frampton se dedicó a corregir a cada uno de los alumnos, alabó ciertos proyectos que estaban muy interesantes, les hizo unas críticas y estuvo más de una hora corrigiendo con ellos. Le agradecimos entonces y volvemos a agradecer hoy su enorme generosidad y el sentido de responsabilidad que mantiene con las nuevas generaciones de arquitectos en formación. Son estas nuevas generaciones las que hoy se encuentran aquí para escuchar el desarrollo del regionalismo crítico, concepto clave para nuestra facultad, que se ubica en una de las más hermosas regiones de Chile y cuya identidad es íntimamente ligada al territorio y a las culturas que en este habitan, buscando activamente un equilibrio entre las fuerzas universales y las regionales. Es con gran alegría entonces que quisiera darle la bienvenida al profesor Kenneth Frampton, quien nos acompaña desde Nueva York, para que nos entregue su charla titulada Regionalismo Crítico Revisitado. Professor Frampton, welcome. You are muted.
You're muted,
Sorry.
Professor Frampton. You need to unmute your microphone.
There it is. It's okay.
Okay?
Yes.
Okay, good.
Now.
Yes.
All right, so first image, of course. Anyway, first, before I get to that, it's a great honor to have an opportunity to talk to you in Temuco and in collaboration with my very close friend, Alberto Foyo. And, but it's just a great privilege and it's also a little strange at the same time, partly because of the wonderful invention of Zoom, which creates a kind of a totally apocalyptical reality. In any case, here we are, and we shall have to get used to this rather bizarre, what can I say, phantom-like way of living. So critical regionalism, of course, really is something quite different. It is pre-Zoom, pre-digital, yes, not quite pre-industrial, but almost. And anyway, as a concept, it's exactly 40 years old. As a term, or perhaps I should say, rather than a concept, the term was first coined by Alex Zonas and Liane Lefebvre in an essay entitled The Grid and the Pathway, which was in fact a kind of discussion of the work of Greek architects Anton Akakis, a husband and wife team that, well, I think, anyway, the husband is still practicing in Athens even now. And so this is their term, critical regionalism, and I basically borrowed it. The essay is dating from 1981. And I first make use of the term in 1983, so there is this 2-year gap. But before I go there, what's interesting about this book that we are looking at, it's almost a book, in fact, it's an issue of the Dutch magazine Oase. It's Oase number 103, which, amazingly enough, which came out in 2019, 2 years ago, and was in fact, well, it was the occasion of a series of, very interesting and also very critical articles, not entirely convinced about the whole hypothesis of critical regionalism. Most of the participants in this critical journal. And, but I was very honored to be part of this resume, so to speak. And from this resume comes the title of this lecture, because this is also a kind of revisiting. Next, please. Yes, so you've seen this already on the poster. It is 1973 to 76, as you can see. It is, in fact, the elevation and the cross-section of Jornesson's Bergsvej Church, just outside Copenhagen, in the suburbs of Copenhagen, in fact. And it is, for me, a kind of, well, on this occasion anyway, it's a sort of synthetic work, because what you're looking at here, of course, is the cross-section through the church itself, a little chapel to the right, and then there are kind of rooms for the priests, and then also some community rooms for the society, including the Boy Scouts room, I think, etc. It's typical kind of a Lutheran church program, in as much as the church is also at the same time a community center. But what fascinates me about this building is, if you look at the elevation at the top, it's very well organized, it's modular construction, it's actually the entire kind of wall that covers one side of the building, it's more or less the same, both sides for that matter, is compounded out of concrete blocks and concrete infill panels, and you can see the difference between the blocks and the panels that makes this kind of step formation on the exterior of the building. One might note also that the aisles of the church, which are very narrow slots basically, are covered in greenhouse glazing. In fact, you can see that also in the elevation. And but what's fascinating, I think, about the elevation, apart from the fact that it's made up of systematically organized prefabricated modular elements, also all concrete, elements that fill in a reinforced concrete frame. And this reinforced concrete frame is in 2 layers. When you look at the section, you can see the inner face of one of these frames. And these frames are in situ concrete. So there is a sort of transition between a skeleton concrete frame to a diaphragm wall made of in situ reinforced concrete. And this receives this extraordinary curved reinforced concrete vaults that cross the nave. And you can see that that's what they're doing in the section here. And this building is of key importance because of two reasons. Well, maybe more than two. I mean, the interplay between rational modular construction and expressive, not so rational reinforced concrete vault construction. I mean, rational technologically, but perhaps not so rational from the point of view of sheer economy. The decision to use vaults was obviously a symbolic decision. And well, if we pass to the next, I think this building will become more understandable. But before we do so, it's important that you can see the basement here, because the basement is a kind of earthwork. And I think throughout Utzon's practice, there is this kind of tension between, or opposition perhaps, dialogue between roof work and earthwork. So you can see it very clearly here. The entire church, in a way, with its framework, is in fact a roof work, and the basement, which you don't see visually, of course, is underground, but it is by definition an earthwork. So there's a play here between different opposites, between rational and expressive, between modular and plastic, sculptural, between earthwork, roofwork, etc., between East and West. In my opinion, there is a kind of self-conscious synthesis here between Western building tradition and Eastern building tradition. And I will come back to that in the kind of more formal part of the lecture, which will follow in due course. The next, please. So this is actually a cover of a book that documents this church, and you can see, the geometry of the undulating vaults, these circles, are set against the modular rhythm of the sides of the building, the aisles, in fact. Next, please. And here you see the aisles, you see it rather clearly, and also you can see the greenhouse glazing which covers the aisles. I mean, the aisles are really not aisles as we would normally understand them in a church, but are really almost passageways, actually. And you can see here, that the difference between the reinforced concrete skeleton frame and the concrete block infill, and also, I've already mentioned it, I think, the greenhouse glazing on top. Next, please. Inside, then, you get these reinforced concrete vaults that go into one of the inner frames, because there are then, in fact, across the transverse section of the church, 4 frames: the outer frame, inner frame, then the vault, then again inner frame, outer frame. And you see how, the altar, for example, is built out of concrete blocks, so is the screen behind the altar, etc. So, and even the earthwork is covered in precast concrete planks. Next, please. And here we're in one of what I've been calling the aisles. As I said, they're really more in the dimension, in the character of passageways. You can see the greenhouse glazing and the reinforced concrete frame, which is picked out here, in natural concrete color as opposed to the block infill. Next, please. So in 1980, as it so happens, the first edition of this book, Modern Architecture Critical History, was published. And it was published in exactly the same year as the Venice Biennale of 1980, which was organized by Paolo Portuguesi and the American architect Robert Stern. I was a member of the original commissioning body, but I resigned almost after the first meeting because I could see that it was going in a certain direction, in what one might call a postmodern scenographic direction. And I was incredibly shocked by that. And in fact, then the article, Critical Regionalism, which the original article of 1983, which bore the title Critical Regionalism, 6 Points for an Architecture of Resistance, was written and published in Hal Foster's anthology, The Anti-Aesthetic, Essays in Postmodern Culture. And yeah, so that is coming out like 2 years after the term is first coined. So 1980, the book is published. 1981, the term is coined by Zonis and Lefebvre. 1983 is the essay. 1980, of course, is also the year of the Biennale. And why I'm emphasizing this is the first edition of this book was written, it took me 10 years to write it, from 1970 to 1980, and was really a kind of a book that still thought of the history of the modern movement in terms of a modern project, in terms of a liberative social project. So that it's ironic that it should be published in the same year as the advent of postmodernity, so to speak, on this occasion, in any case, on the occasion of the Venice Biennale. Next, please. Well, we've seen this before, so next. Yes, so in the 1985 edition of the book, I will try to expand on the idea of critical regionalism. I will try to expand on the essay by giving examples. And it's in the chapter that will be added to the end of the book in the second edition of 1985, 2 years after the essay. And I showed a few buildings, one of which is here, which is Cadurk's Siemens building in Barceloneta, in Barcelona, of 1951, in fact, covered in brick with rather traditional shutters, with a kind of flat roof, but the flat roof used as a kind of classical, or let's say reduced classical canopy or cornice, so that you can see that the language of this building is partly modern, but also, it's modern in the sense that the reinforced concrete slabs are clearly expressed. It's modern by virtue of its faceted nature, I suppose. It's modern because of its modular nature. But the use of a particular kind of traditional adjustable Venetian blinds, use of brickwork, etc., all of this is a mediation of modernity. And in that sense, it also has a kind of regional reference. And I gave it as one example of such a critical regionalist building. I think we can say actually that all the work of Jose Antonio Cadurk was of that character. Next, please. And this is the plan of that building, in fact. And you see it has, of course, built-in terraces. It's very kind of economic. It's very organic in a way. You can detect, in a sense, the influence of Wright, I think, in this building. So vis-a-vis a kind of objective modernity, it's not an objective kind of rationalist, functionalist modernity. It's already a kind of departure, which you can see in the plan. Next, please. And here, another departure. Actually, this house was known in the office during the time that it was designed as the bomb house, because it looks like a kind of cubic house. It's in Povoa do Varzim in Portugal. It's actually a building designed by Álvaro Ziza, and it's an relatively early work, 1972. And well, the most the most interesting thing about it, apart from its audacity, it's kind of, I suppose, makes a certain reference to Cubism in a way, to Cubist painting, perhaps even, although there's nothing painterly about it. It's using the language of the modern movement, in fact, but it's kind of deliberately sort of subverting that language. And one of the ways in which it's subverted is actually through the glass fenestration, because although this looks as though it's metal, it's made of wood, all the glass. Of course, the glass is carefully screened on the inside, as opposed to the Kaderka apartment building with blinds, but which is not the most efficient way of resisting heat buildup. But is in fact this building in the fenestration, which is hard to see, of course, from this material, combines both casement windows and sash windows. And part of the story is that sash windows came to Portugal via Britain as part of the trade in port and sherry between Britain and Porto in particular. So there are many kind of layers to this building. It isn't a straightforward functional, it certainly isn't a straightforward functional rational work. It even sort of plays with the idea of ruin. So it's almost like a self-conscious ruin in a way. Next, please. But this ruin is contained by a boundary, which is a very important aspect, and I will come back to it. And you can see how the plan, which is, in a way rational, orthogonal, relatively well organized, is then eaten away in this very surreal fashion by the fenestration looking onto the garden. So that the garden, which is to the left of this image, is enclosed by a low wall, and the house is in black, you see, enclosed by a slightly higher wall, so that in a way the place of the house is very carefully defined. And we will also see how place is one of those issues, or rather place versus space. Next, please. And I'm including this, or rather this is in that chapter. It's a strange thing to put under the term of regional identity, I guess. It's in fact a perimeter block. So in that sense, of course, it's also a boundary. It's a building that was never built. There's a kind of complex sort of play on between what is enclosed by the building. It's a housing block, in fact, designed by the Austrian architect Raymond Abraham for the International Bauausstellung in Berlin. Never built, but I included it because of the way in which it refers to the ground. I mean, the earth itself, as though it's kind of, as a project at least, inscribed into the ground. Next, please. Next, okay. Well, Barragan comes in for a certain otherness. You could say, well, I'm trying to bring, it's a good point to make, it's a good moment to make the point that I have insisted on a number of occasions that critical regionalism is a mode of beholding rather than anything that is identifiable as an actual ism. It's a way of looking at things. So a way of looking at things and a way of interpreting things. Of course, looking and interpreting in order to be part of a constant developing cultural tradition. And in this case, this very remarkable, striking work made out of concrete, consisting of, I think, 7 obelisks, triangular in plan, each obelisk, totally useless, no function at all, made out of concrete in the middle of an auto route in Mexico City, designed by Luis Barragan and Matthias Goritz, German sculptor, close collaborator of Barragan. Painted in different primary colors, and it's still there, of course. And well, what's fascinating is, of course, in a way, it's an instant landmark. And that brings up another fascinating issue about the way we live in a world, or we tend to live more and more in a world which is dominated by the automobile, of course, and by diffusion of cities into the countryside, the so-called megalopolis, you know, and in fact, this monument, if you like, was built as the center of a kind of large development, a large suburban development. And there is, to coin a famous aphorism of Gertrude Stein, there is no more there. In order to there be a somewhere, so to speak, Barragan and Goritz decided to make this monumental tower complex in order to establish a place in a kind of continuous placelessness. Next, please. Well, it's another example of place in relation to site, and also the idea of building the site. In this case, it's Amancio Williams. It's a house for his composer father, in a bridge house, in fact, in reinforced concrete construction. Of course, this is the section. It's built over a stream. The stream has been sort of artificially modified in order to make this kind of ellipse beneath the arch. It's actually a section cut through the central axis of the house, so that one is cut through a staircase. You know, it's almost a metaphysical work, really, because you can enter it from both sides, enter the staircase, that is, and the staircase brings you up to a single floor, and there's a continuous living space on that floor. Next, please. Or this, for example, which is the Quirini Stampalia by the Italian architect Carlo Scarpa in Venice. It's 1961. And what's fascinating here is first of all, this question of water and Venice. And Venice is, yes, the extraordinary miracle of building the city in the middle of, well, hardly the open sea, but certainly a lagoon, and in the middle of water. And indeed, the city in the middle of water is constantly, even more, of course, of late, subject to flooding, you know, the so-called acqua alta. And this little garden to the museum that Scarpa designed in Venice for the organization, the cultural organization known as the Quirini Stampalia, which is both a library and a gallery. And what we see here is a kind of very elaborate play with water. And we see the Lion of Venice, by the way, a lion in any case, that is facing the water passing under the lion and through this, into this sump. So, I mean, the whole garden really is a play of multiple levels. It's definitely a discernible place, a bounded place, and referential to the characteristic of that particular place, i.e. Venice. Actually, Scarpa says somewhere, I'm a man of Byzantium who came to Venice by way of Greece. Next, please. Well, this is actually by a Swiss architect called Dolf Schnebly. It's in Castiglione in the Ticino, and is of course somewhat influenced by Le Corbusier. But well, this vaulted form and these brick walls, you know, are referential, I think, to regional culture. Next, please. Or this by another Ticinese architect, much more famous than Dolph Schneebly's, in fact, is Mario Botta, an early work by Mario Botta, A House in Riva San Vitale. As a matter of fact, of course, very influenced by the metaphysical architecture of Aldo Rossi, because this strange conjunction between sort of 19th century footbridge in a way that gives access to the house, and the brick, supporting walls of the house, which is a concrete slab and a brick construction. In fact, related to a strange kind of building type in the region, in the Ticino, that is, known as roccoli, or bird-catching towers. So there is this self-conscious reference on the part of Botta to this kind of slightly bizarre vernacular mode of actually capturing wild birds. Next, please. And here by Botta and by his colleague, the late Luigi Snozzi, is, I think, a very interesting example, a project, of course, not built, of critical regionalism in a topographic sense, in that what we're looking at is the main railway station of Zurich, shown drawn hardline in the foreground here, and all the buildings of the late 19th century from which the center of Zurich is composed. And to the right, you can just make out the National Museum of Switzerland in this kind of Gothic revival mode. And then you have these covered platforms that go out, and all of that exists. What doesn't exist, and what has been projected but will never exist, is this bridge-like form that crosses over the rail. You know, this is the major rail terminus in Switzerland, and all the railhead comes in here, and they expand the services of the existing terminus by building this bridge of additional services on top of as a bridge structure over the rails coming in. And what's fascinating is it marks a line of a buried tributary of the main river of Zurich, Limmat. You can see left and right, I think, this little stream that is paralleled by trees. And then on top of the bridge building, there is this kind of echo of these trees. I think it's a fascinating project by it's the early 70s by Botta and Snozzi. Yeah, I mean, it's critically regional in its intent, I would say, and also in its topographic aspect. Next. Well, Ando, this is an early house, the Coscino house. It's 1981. It's actually and it's important to say that I haven't said it up to now, but I should say that, of course, none of these architects that I've shown up to now would identify themselves as being critically regionalist. I mean, my bracketing them under this term is a kind of, if you like, a sort of act of critical impudence, really. I mean, what is fascinating in the case of Ando is that in a certain sense, he accepts from the modern movement the kind of abstract cubistic, well, particularly, of course, from Le Corbusier, reinforced concrete, purist, prismatic form, and then embeds it in the site in this fashion. It's hard to see all the ramifications here. This is actually in Ashir, which is in the kind of rather expensive suburb of the port near Osaka, because he also comes from Osaka, in fact, Tadao Ando. It's a building that is kind of again, it creates a site, it builds a site. That's an important issue. You know, that the building is built into the site in a sense. It's just as important to construct the site as it is to construct the building. That's also true of the work of Mario Botta. Next, please. Now, this is the plan of the house. And it's hard to read it because it's very faint, but well, the most intriguing thing here about East-West relationships, I mean, this is the house of a top Japanese fashion designer, Junko Kishino, and you can just make it out that the dining table, which has 6 chairs against it, those 6 chairs are for Westerners, and the floor of the living dining room is recessed under the table so it can receive the chairs, and the Westerners can sit at the table at the same table as Japanese, who will sit on the floor of the raised floor of the living room, so that you have you know, Japanese on the one hand and let's say Westerners on the other, who are guests, of course, of the international fashion designer, sitting at the same table, the same flat surface, but able to sit in the posture that belongs to their culture, so to speak, and so that you here have a kind of East-West dialogue that is acted out in the furnishing of a building. Next, please. And this is in a way a beginning, or the beginning for me, that I came to this site, which is outside the Acropolis in Athens, so-called Philopappou Hill, that was finished by the Greek architect Dimitri Pikionis in 1959. And by complete accident, I came to this site in the very year it was finished. And I found it incredibly impressive because I realized as walking across the site that it was built, of course, it was a landscape work. It was built of, you know, demolished bits and pieces, stone from, actually, I think in the end, from demolished late 19th century Athenian neoclassical houses. And it is a kind of montage, and it's a montage that can, of course, be read by the eyes, but more importantly, it is read by the body in walking across the surface. Next, please. And this is a building that by Anton Akakis in Athens. And it combines, and it's hard to really express it here, both the idea of the grid and the idea of the pathway, because the essay of 1981 it had this title, The Grid and the Pathway. And here the grid and the pathway are kind of built together. And that essay of 1981 was really the draft opening of this appreciation of the work of Anton Akakis. Next, please. And here, yeah, well, obviously, of course, influenced by Le Corbusier, but you can see how the assembly and the topography of the interior is expressed on the exterior. In other words, the pathway comes through the grid. Next, please. Right, so this brings me then to the part of this lecture which is without images, and which a version of which is in the hands of the translator, and one hopes that something like simultaneous translation can be achieved. I mean, I thought getting this piece together in something of a hurry when my library is not actually in my possession at this very moment was something of a challenge. But, and also going back, of course, to something that one worked on 40 years ago is another kind of challenge. And you could say, I think, yeah, I'm inclined to say, you know, that altogether this theme of critical regionalism is long since kind of played out, you know. And yet the idea seems to have a life of its own. And like, for instance, the magazine Oase that I showed you at the beginning, 2019, I mean, I didn't initiate this. This was initiated by the Dutch. I mean, it's entirely, I had no idea to revisit critical regionalism, so to speak. It's not that I, let's say, deny the validity of it at the time that I was most intensely involved with it in the early 80s. It's not that I don't think it has, that it has not had a kind of productive life. I mean, I know that the idea, which in the end, you know, is as much due to Alex Zonas and Liane Lefebvre as to myself, you know, has had a life. Yes, a life. It has been a kind of inspiration, I think, outside the transatlantic Eurocentric world, in Latin America, of course, but also in China and in Japan, and yeah, maybe some extent. Well, also in Europe itself. I mean, Southern Europe, I think, you know, well, like a figure like Alvaro Ziza, you know, has also been generous enough to say, well, you know, I think that the whole theme of critical regionalism does apply to my work in a way, or indirectly so. So, you know, I have very mixed feelings about it, really. And so I thought, in order to have a way of breathing a certain life back into this topic, that I would come to the two parts of the original essay. So very briefly and in a very fragmented way, the part that's about the built examples, which I've tried to hint at in the illustrations to the chapter on critical regionalism in the second edition of Modern Architectural Critical History, and then turn to the subtitle, because the subtitle was 6 Points for an Architecture of Resistance, and then talk about the 6 points in terms of writers who profoundly influenced me, and in writing these, in attempting to articulate these 6 points. And one of the first writers is the French philosopher Paul Ricoeur, and the issue of yes, his use of the terms universal civilization and national cultures. It now seems to be somewhat out of date. So let me pass to this first point. So with this number 1 in brackets in the text that the translator has, hopefully before him or her. 1, the first of the 6 points posits, the first of the 6 points dwelt on the distinction made by the French philosopher Paul Ricoeur in his 1961 essay, Universal Civilization and National Cultures, in which he wrote, and I quote, "The phenomena of universal civilization, while being an advancement of mankind, is at the same time a kind of destruction and deterioration of traditional culture." And he goes on, but he identifies universal civilization as universal technology. And he identifies culture as the ethical and mythical nucleus of mankind. And the quote ends with the following phrase, or following sentences. "It is a fact, every culture cannot absorb the shock of modern civilization." There is the paradox. how to revive an old dormant civilization and take place in universal civilization, which, as I've already said, means, of course, universal technology. My second point was entitled The Rise and Fall of the Avant-Garde, because, of course, what I had experienced in a way through writing this history, that one can discern quite clearly the rise and fall of the avant-garde, above all, of course, in Russia after the revolution of 1917 and the total eclipse of the avant-garde in 1931 by Stalin, of course, and the beginning of socialist realism, this kind of pseudo-classical state expression imposed on all buildings. So, after the revolution, there is this enormous outburst of energy which produces a kind of dynamic modernity, totally without any reference to history or tradition, largely of glass, steel, concrete, etc., very dynamic, and I must say, as a young student, extremely influential on myself. So, the fall of the avant-garde, of course, is first and foremost the fall of the Russian avant-garde, but then, of course, other so-called avant-gardes also fall, And, well, I'm thinking of the German rationalist New Objectivity, which was also very prominent in Switzerland, and of which the architect Hannes Meyer is kind of the ultimate representative, if you like. Hannes Meyer, Mats Stam, etc. This, and the architects of the Weimar Republic who built a lot of housing between the foundation of the Republic in 1933, that was also a kind of socialist architectural avant-garde, which is also eclipsed, in this case, of course, in Germany, eclipsed by the Third Reich. And I was very influenced, and this is the point, by the one-time Marxist art critic Clement Greenberg, when he wrote in 1938 a very, I think, remarkable essay bearing the title Avant-Garde and Kitsch. And this essay was a kind of reaction against totalitarian superimposed pseudo-historical styles. I mean, in the case of the Soviet Union, of course, the socialist realism. In the case of the Third Reich, the kind of neoclassical Schinkel-esque style of, well, there are many styles in the Third Reich, and all of them, of course, anti-modern in various ways. And also, of course, fascist Italy, etc. He sees all of this as a kind of kitsch. And that's the importance of this essay for me, and leads me, of course, to this second point, which is the rise and fall of the avant-garde. And in 1965, the same Greenberg will write of, this time of painting, of modern painting and not of architecture, the following, and I will quote it. Having been deprived by the Enlightenment of all tasks they could take seriously, the arts looked as though they were going to be assimilated to entertainment, pure and simple. And entertainment, like religion, looked as though it were going to be assimilated to therapy. The arts could save themselves by demonstrating that the kind of experience they provided was valid in its own right and could not be obtained by any other kind of activity. With this formulation, he more or less formulates the idea of relative autonomy amongst different artistic disciplines. And this provoked me to think that relative autonomy when it comes to architecture had to be based upon the fact that it was a constructed thing, that it was built, that, and it is this that will lead me eventually, of course, to move away from critical regionalism, and in 1992 to publish a book with the title Studies in Tectonic Culture, which was an attempt to trace the evolution of a poetic of construction in 19th and 20th century architecture. And so this was my second point, moving towards the tectonic. My third point had the temerity to put on one side critical regionalism, on the other side world culture. And I argued that while it was misleading to conceive of our inheriting world culture, i.e., inheriting world culture in the same way as we inherit universal civilization, i.e., universal technology, at the same time, by virtue of long-standing traditions, we are subject, all of us, to the influence of world culture. And I recall that at that time I was in the habit of reminding students that classical Greek sculpture was unthinkable without the precedent of Egyptian sculpture, and that Japanese domestic architecture was unthinkable without the precedent of Chinese domestic and temple architecture. In my 1983 essay, I emphasized, this possibility of a synthesis between Eastern and Western culture, and I gave as an example, and we've already been over it twice. Utsen's Bergsvej Church, built outside Copenhagen in 1976, and as I've already explained, here you can readily see how the modular play of reinforced concrete blocks and panels against a reinforced concrete frame in relation to in situ reinforced concrete vaults across the nave is given a synthetic expression in this building. And one can see, the articulation, the rational modular articulation of the elements as being quote unquote Occidental. And one can see the formation of the vaults as being, Oriental, in as much as this formation in a religious building suggests, let's say, Chinese pagoda form, And so it's this I have in mind. And one other thing perhaps needs to be emphasized is that for reasons that it's still not entirely clear to me, Danish architectural culture was very influenced by China, going back into the 20s, 30s, and so on. So there is, in Utsen's work, this, amongst other things, this constant reference to China. My fourth point was to emphasize the question of place form as opposed to space. And here, space in the sense of sort of endless space. And here, of course, the main inspiration is Martin Heidegger and his essay, Building, Dwelling, Thinking, in which there is this very beautiful passage about boundary. And I quote, "A boundary is not that at which something stops, but as the Greeks recognized, the boundary is that from which something begins its presidency. There is the implication that we, in our individual persona, can only come fully into being in a clearly bounded domain." My fifth point was the simple and well-known opposition between culture and nature, most evident surely in such things as topography, context, climate, light, and tectonic form in relation to gravity. And I gave as an example the Greek column, the Greek Doric column, in which there is this expression of load in a Greek Doric column that is emphasized by the flutes. I mean, that is a very fascinating thing, because if you think about it, a Greek classical column was built up of separate cylinders of stone. which were, of course, shaped to give a kind of, well, to give a shape that, so the column is wider at the bottom than the capital, but of course, constantly interrupted by the horizontals of the various blocks of stone. And the flutes that are then cut on the column bring the column as an idea, as a concept into being, because it's almost certain that originally it was a prehistoric, well, very ancient Greek temples were made out of wood, where the columns were wooden. And making the temple out of stone in order to assure its permanence, this very expensive, of course. But then in order to give the meaning of the form, having to cut flutes into the column. I mean, maybe that's the clearest analogy that I can make. So this was to do with nature culture, and including the tectonic under that, the relationship between structural form and gravity, and the way in which structural form is made. And therefore the Greek column, as I've just talked about, is expressing, of course, exactly that, the relationship to gravity and the relationship to the way it is made. It's obvious that heat and climate, sun control, etc., all of this has, like vis-a-vis nature culture, an impact upon built form. My sixth and last point was to emphasize the difference between the visual and the tactile, and to make the argument that, in fact, we experience the environment phenomenologically, but in the totality of our body being, so to speak. We experience it simultaneously, both visually and in terms of touch, tactile, either touch involving our actual hands or touch in the sense, and this brings me back to Piccionis's landscape next to the Acropolis in Athens, made out of this reused stone, and if you recall when I talked about that, that's what I experienced in 959, the fact that one experienced this place as much through one's body, through one's legs, of course, as through one's eyes. And that's my 6 points. I think I will just stop and we will have a few questions. Thanks.
Fantástico. Muchísimas gracias. Entonces, le agradecemos al profesor Kenneth Frampton por habernos entregado esta maravillosa presentación y por compartir sus conocimientos con nosotros. A continuación, quisiera entonces recuperar preguntas de la audiencia para que podamos profundizar en algunos de los tópicos que el profesor Frampton nos ha introducido. Y también, por lo mismo, les recuerdo que el chat a partir de ahora está abierto para recoger todas las dudas y preguntas que ustedes tengan o que quieran compartir con nosotros. Por lo tanto, los y las invito a que vayan dejando sus preguntas desde ahora, sus comentarios, y se los haremos saber al profesor Frampton a su debido tiempo. Por ahora quisiera darle la palabra a nuestra decana, María Sándor Vallespir, para que inicie la conversación con una pregunta dirigida al profesor Kenneth Frampton. Decana.
Dear Kenneth, I'm so impressed with the conference. I have the audio, so I will, okay. In your lecture, you posit that it's important that whatever is being built also takes into the consideration the building of the site. How do you consider that we should do this in order to be critical regionalist? And are there any particular ways in which the topography, duality of Chile, ocean, Andes, can take advantage of this construction of the site?
Well, I don't know that. I don't know that part of Chile, of course. I don't know Chile at all. And so it's hard to say, but you know, one of the most interesting things I think about modernity is that when it comes to putting a building in the ground, one is at an archaic moment, no matter what. You know? And if you think of, you know, let's say, you know, one tries to rationalize building production, et cetera, but when, you know, using, let's say, prefabricated building or off-site construction. So, you know, but when you come to putting the building in the ground, it's as primitive as it ever was, you know, because the ground is, you know, the earth is primitive in itself, you know, so that you know, when you open it up, you know, you often discover all sorts of things, that's particularly true in Rome, for example, where building a building is almost impossible because you constantly come across Roman ruins when you open up the site, and then you can't work anymore because they have to, et cetera, but maybe the other important issue is that it is also very dramatic, the point at which the building goes into the ground. Therefore, this point of the earthwork is, I think, of fundamental importance. You know, the exact way that the entering of the building into the ground is expressed. You know, the relationship of the building to the ground, and the nature of the fabric of the earthwork. You know, that expresses that moment. You know, and that, yeah, and also that necessity, that function. And I'm trying to think of, you know, well, of course, I gave you this. There, of course, in the case of Bach's Faad, the earthwork is invisible because it's just a basement in the church of Utzon. But you know, there's a very beautiful drawing of Utzon that shows a kind of podium raised above the ground and a roof, a Chinese roof actually, floating over the top of it. And so that, though he doesn't use these terms, in this little sketch, the earthwork and the roofwork are identified as being in a dialogue with each other. And I think that that's a very important aspect. And so this question of the way the earthwork is made, you know, is critical. I mean, if you think of the Scarpa Quirini Stampali, which I showed, you know, the earthwork there is very evident. You know, all these different levels, the channeling of water, et cetera, all of this is part of the earthwork.
Fantástico. Muchas gracias, profesor Frampton. Tenemos otra pregunta a cargo de Alberto Sato. Alberto Sato quiere hacer la pregunta oralmente, así que le vamos a dar la palabra a Alberto Sato para que haga su pregunta.
Hi, Kenneth. Voy a hacer una pregunta. Ya. No, lo voy a hacer en Spanish. ¿Ya? Ok. Yo creo que el profesor Kenneth Frampton es totalmente consciente de las consecuencias que ha tenido su documento, su paper del año 83. En Latinoamérica, al menos, eso ha despertado una, si se quiere, una gran movilización, precisamente en el sentido contrario, creo, a las propias intenciones del profesor Frampton. Es decir, hubieron traductores, tales como Marina Weidman, como Cristian Fernández Cox, etcétera, y Enrique Braune, que han entendido esto casi como una acción moral y militante que tuvo consecuencias y que coincidió precisamente con un momento histórico de Latinoamérica de dictaduras. digamos que eso movilizó mucha gente. Y el regionalismo crítico se convirtió entonces en un arma de política. Lo que quiero, en realidad, lo que me inquieta, es que quería saber qué grado de actualidad podría dársele a esta lectura del regionalismo crítico, porque me faltó una segunda parte de tu discurso, que es lo revisitado que es. Es decir, me siento gran curiosidad para saber cómo en esta coyuntura histórica, después de haber transcurrido casi 30 años, no más de 30 años, de ese momento de gran entusiasmo por ese documento, inclusive que ha recorrido toda América Latina además, yo no sé si en el resto del mundo ha sucedido, si se ha despertado el entusiasmo con que se despertó aquí en América Latina tu documento, ¿no? Pero en América Latina quisiera saber, después de haber transcurrido ese tiempo, qué grado de vigencia o qué actualidad podría tener esta formulación teórica.
Yeah. Well, there are two thoughts come to mind. One is that I never made it explicit, but I always sort of hinted at the fact that what I had in mind was a certain political sovereignty involved in this assertion of critical regional culture. And I have not alluded to it just now, but I think it's also maybe anyone who is familiar with my preoccupations knows that I was very influenced by this German philosopher Hannah Arendt, who in fact was a pupil of Heidegger, but the one thing that I have not emphasized, I think, enough is the concept of Arendt of the space of appearance, which is also, in her case, a political concept. I mean, she is someone who admired, I think throughout her life, the workers' councils that were formed immediately after the Russian Revolution, and these councils were ruthlessly suppressed by the Bolshevik Party. And she is someone who believes, in a kind of, I suppose, in a kind of direct democracy. I mean, the model, of course, is ancient Greece, but the closer to her own moment in history, of course, is, as it happens, the workers' councils, and that's something that I've never made explicit, but which preoccupies me. This idea of the space of appearance, which is both a cultural and a political idea. So I think that one of the responsibilities of even now of architects is the creation of this space of appearance. And I would like to give an example, which comes from Sao Paulo, and is the mayor, I think her name, Marta, maybe, I'm not sure I have that right, Suplicy, who was mayor of Sao Paulo a few years ago, member of Lula's Workers' Party, who managed to build 42 schools, I think I'm right, in Sao Paulo, in favelas. And these schools, I see these schools as spaces of public appearance in the Arendtian sense. They of course were designed to function as schools and as community centers. Here, of course, one's not talking about architectural language necessarily. One's talking about the program, which is the political program, and one's talking about, I think, program in an architectural sense, in as much as the schools were expressly designed to function both as schools during the day and as community centers at night and at weekends, as spaces of public appearance, in fact, And in favelas where there is no space of public appearance. I mean, we don't know very much about all of this. I mean, these schools have never been properly documented or published. Is this critical regionalism? Well, in terms of expression, not necessarily. And then the other thought that your question raises is this question of the, of autonomy, or let's say poetic. I think that this is an idea which is not incompatible with the political idea, but it is something that is relatively autonomous. It relates to tradition, of course, and to ideas about world creation. I mean, maybe that's also an important notion, that architecture is, each work of architecture, no matter how small, is a kind of the creation of a world, of a microcosmos. And that microcosmos can, and perhaps where possible, should have political connotations, but it also has other aspects which I've tried to allude to, and which I think this original formulation alluded to. And I agree with you in a sense that the title of the lecture is misleading in as much as, is it really revisited? Well, I'm revisiting it right now, thanks to your question.
Fantástico. Muchas gracias, Alberto Sato. Muchas gracias a Kenneth Frampton por su excelente conversación. Ahora le quiero ceder la palabra al profesor Daniel Rudolph, de la Facultad de Arquitectura, Artes y Diseño, que tiene también una pregunta y desea formularla de manera oral. Así que, Daniel, te cedo la palabra.
El micrófono.
Creo que está sin audio,
ahora sí.
Daniel. Ahí sí.
Ahora sí. Buenas tardes. Muchas gracias, profesor Kenneth Frampton. Para nosotros es realmente un honor poder compartir con usted y especialmente a nuestros estudiantes, quienes, digamos, tienen el honor de escucharlo a usted y desde Temuco, desde una escuela nueva, una escuela que está naciendo, ¿cierto? Y en ese sentido, en el sentido de ese microcosmos que estamos de alguna manera creando, utilizando la palabra que usted recién usó, de esa creación de ese microcosmos que estamos acá intentando armar, ¿cierto? Y desde la perspectiva del aprendizaje de la arquitectura, ¿cuál es esa vigencia, digamos, o cuál es ese, en el sentido de lo que usted habló de los límites de Heidegger, de aquello, digamos, en virtud de lo cual algo concluye, es decir, algo no es aquello, un límite a partir de aquello que concluye, sino a partir donde algo comienza a ser, ¿cierto? Entonces inicia su esencia, y en ese sentido nosotros estamos construyendo de alguna manera esos límites, ¿cierto? ¿Cómo se da en este momento para una escuela de arquitectura esa relación entre la creación de esos límites, ¿cierto? Y la creatividad que nosotros, digamos, de alguna manera intentamos abrir, ¿cierto? Y producir en nuestros estudiantes. ¿Cuáles son esos como desafíos que usted ve que nosotros en esta región del mundo tenemos por delante?
Yeah, well, it's a bit difficult to say because I don't know the region, and I would like to, but I mean, I don't. And so, yeah, I mean, you could say, I think right now, for example, that architectural schools, not only in Chile, but everywhere, you know, particularly in the United States, but also in England, and maybe less so in other parts. I mean, Switzerland, maybe not so much, or in Portugal, for example, where a certain tradition is very strongly established. But in Anglo-America in particular, in the United States and also in the UK, there is I think, considerable uncertainty inside architectural schools. And part of this is of course coming from the power center, from the government, from the state. You know, I think that's particularly true in the UK and in the US. You know, yes, I mean it has to do with, of course, the way universities acquire funds. You know, and so, you know, certain universities like MIT in Cambridge, Massachusetts, you know, it's always been the case, has been heavily funded by the government, because, you know, yeah, by the Pentagon for that matter, because it's the high point of techno-scientific education and research in the United States. You know, well, there are other research universities, of course, but this relationship between the state, the government, and technology and research and money, you know, is a big factor. And why I'm saying this is because I think that schools of architecture have become somewhat unclear about what is the role of the architect, you know? and you know, the question of what are the limits of an architect in this moment in time, et cetera, you know. And well, I suppose it was always a challenge for schools of architecture, but it's more of a challenge now, maybe, than in the past. So it's a hard challenge to answer. I mean, part of it, of course, is you know, I think that an aspect, to some extent, it's a question of limits, of course, architects should have some kind of political, philosophical education in order to understand, you know, in part through history, of course, what exactly has this field of building art been, you know. It fascinates me that there are two words, which I think perhaps also happen in other languages, between architecture on the one hand and building on the other. You know, I think many young people experience this, you know, that let's say their parents don't understand exactly what is it. I mean, you're not exactly a builder, so what, that kind of funny ambiguity, which is an ambiguity that's always been present in a way in the field, I think, you know. And so to understand that ambiguity and to understand it in relation to politics and history and culture, the history of modernity, you know, to the process of modernization, so that one understands the limits of the field, and that's what one should try to do, I think. And therefore, you know, choose programs for buildings, you know, for the students that are relevant to the historical situation, you know, but are not driven by that situation, are in a way both aware of the situation, but able to take a position in relation to that situation. That, I think, is the challenge that faces architecture schools, faces universities, and and the schools inside universities. And this is a rather long and perhaps not very clear answer, but this is what your question has provoked in me.
Muchas gracias, profesor Frampton. Gracias. Espero, Daniel, que haya quedado pues, una buena respuesta. Bien, hacemos una pregunta del público. La audiencia le quiere preguntar, profesor Frampton, y voy a retomar aquí una pregunta de Marcelo Sandoval, quien pregunta lo siguiente. Marcelo pregunta y dice, la carencia de identidad en la arquitectura viene sin duda de la mano de la especulación inmobiliaria. ¿Qué opina del reciente referéndum alemán que concluyó en la expropiación de 240.000 viviendas? Esa es la pregunta, profesor Frampton.
Yeah, well, we're back with politics, of course. You know, I mean, real estate speculation. I mean, well, architecture is impossible at a certain point with real estate speculation. I mean, it's not that builders, developers have not always produced horrifying results, but today we live in a very extreme moment of a kind of out of control capitalism, totally deregulated capitalism. This is the world we are living in. And this is very evident in New York City right now, for example. You know, there's one high-rise building after another. You know, with no control over the height, no control over anything. And each high-rise building is more meaningless than the next one. You know, and I'm speaking not only in terms of you know, what it is exactly, but you know, the actual architectural language used is just, you know, in the sense of a poetic of construction, one is worse than the next. You know, many of them, of course, are covered entirely in glass, and also they are sort of in a way destroying the city, because the skyline of the city is totally kind of ruined by all these competing very thin high rises. You know, it's totally out of control. It is unregulated capitalism, totally. You know, there is no idea of what is the city. No idea at all. You know? So that I don't know what's happening in Chile exactly, but that is the situation in New York. And this reminds me of something. There's an anecdote, really, which has got to do with vision, because I once had an exchange with this wonderful Portuguese architect, Álvaro Zida, when I said to him, actually all of this was in written postcards, well, I hear you have many projects, you must be happy. And he said, wrote back to me and said, you know, it's true I have many projects, but I am not happy. How can one be happy when Europe has no project? I mean, I'll never forget these words. How can one be happy when Europe has no project? And he means, of course, that Europe has lost its vision. It doesn't have an idea of it doesn't have an aim. And the problem with neoliberal political economic world in which we are living is this world doesn't have an aim except to make as much money as possible, as quickly as possible. This is the only aim. There is no other project, none.
Perfecto, clarísimo y contundente, profesor Frampton. El tiempo se nos está agotando, así que tenemos espacio solamente para una pregunta más, lamentablemente, y esa pregunta se la vamos a ceder a Alberto Follo, quien ha pedido la palabra. Así que, Alberto, te cedo la palabra.
Has muteado, Alberto, el audio, querido.
Detalles.
Ahora
Vale.
Sí, el conferenciante anterior que hubo hoy habló de poeta él, habló de la intimidad, habló del fuego, de la tierra, del aire, de la ternura, es decir, de esos sentimientos que se podría decir que son a la vez genéticos y culturales. La palabra cultura hoy la hemos oído repetidamente. Como comentario me atrevería a decir que las culturas parece ser que nos refieren siempre, constantemente, al origen, a lo originario, como nos habló hoy el poeta. Es casi como si fuese un paso sine qua non para después poder hablar de la originalidad o de la creatividad que tanto atañe a una escuela de arte, de diseño y de arquitectura. Y por supuesto a la innovación. Curiosamente se me ocurre, y esto es comentario y obviamente es pregunta, se me ocurre que de lo que menos se ha hablado es de civilización. Hemos hablado de culturas ancestrales, de culturas regionales, pero el término civilización parece que se hace como medio incómodo en este foro. Esa civilización que tal vez es lo que usted ha llamado el capitalismo global, esa civilización uno diría que nos refiere siempre al futuro, al logro, a la conquista y tal vez a la innovación, pero una innovación con el objetivo subcutáneo siempre de amasar poder. Si lo que estoy diciendo tiene algún sentido, la pregunta o el comentario que le pediría es ¿cómo podríamos esperar una reconciliación? ¿Cómo podrían los estudiantes, la generación nueva, intentar soñar con un armisticio entre las culturas regionales de las que se ha hablado hoy y esa civilización universal que parece que está cada vez más en colisión la una con la otra? ¿Qué tipo de armisticio cree usted que sería posible generar en las mentes nuevas de una generación nueva?
Well, maybe I think that this question of climate and the changing climate is a big factor, I think, and it is a way of it is a hope, let's say, that power can come to recognize that it has to act in relation to the changing climate in ways which are more measured, in terms of exploitation. Because unregulated capitalism leads to kind of maximum exploitation. And maximum exploitation is what can I say, is a kind of dead end in relation to nature. Particularly at this moment when nature is really feeding back. It's it cannot continue to be abused in the way that it has been abused by universal technology and by the maximization of everything, basically we come back to the same thing, unregulated capitalism, because it's possible, of course, to recognize that capitalism itself, you could say, has produced certain technical capacities, certain technological capacities which would not have existed if it were not for the capitalism. But on the other hand, the capitalism without any regulation is a capitalism without any project, no project at all, except the commodification of everything. And of course, under these circumstances, a more measured way of living and of making things and of building buildings, you know, can't be achieved, you know, because and this is the problem of you know, which Alvaro, you know, very succinctly says, you know, but how can one be happy when Europe has no project? You know, it is this realization that the project also has to be one of mediating the impact of the changing climate. You know, one simply can't you know, continue in this way, and persuading power that it has to mediate, you know, that it can't continue this rapacious relationship to nature. I mean, this is the challenge, I think. Of course, you can say it's a challenge that lies beyond architecture, but yeah, I think, you know, architecture is deeply affected by it, and you know, you can find the evidence of it both at a large scale and at a small scale. And in fact, I was just made aware of the fact that I think, you know, like 36% of energy emissions, you know, are coming straight from buildings, but particularly the residential sector. So in fact, you know, suburbs, period, worldwide, fed by automobiles, are totally negative from the point of view of climate change, you know, and this kind of pathological individualism, which is what, of course, suburban development is, you know, and the exploitation of a pathological individualism. You know, this has to be struggled against. I mean, there's no other way of approaching it. So even if one doesn't approach the political directly, and in fact, perhaps it's better that one doesn't, one has to face it, you know, in terms of real consequences. I mean, real consequences in the sense of the feedback of climate and et cetera, et cetera. You know, this ruthless exploitation of resources, you know, as though we're never going to exhaust them, you know, or for that matter, of course, the land itself, agriculture, you know, food, of course, food and water. I mean, it's clear that these things, these basic things, could in the future become extremely critical. That's it, I think.
Sin duda. Muy bien. Muy bien. Muchísimas gracias, profesor Frampton, por su acabada respuesta. Estamos nosotros cumpliendo con el horario que teníamos asignado, así que le doy las gracias encarecidamente al profesor Frampton por esta excelente y maravillosa presentación que hemos escuchado, temas sin duda muy pertinentes para toda nuestra escuela, que se ha beneficiado muchísimo de su intelecto y también, como dijimos al comienzo, de su generosidad y su amable disposición. Así que, profesor Frampton, muchísimas gracias por haber estado aquí con nosotros el día de hoy. Con esta última pregunta, entonces, cerramos la segunda parte de la sesión inaugural de nuestro cuarto encuentro interdisciplinario de creación, reflexión e investigación en acción de la Facultad de Arquitectura, Artes y Diseño de la Universidad Católica de Temuco. Quisiera, para poder concluir esta maravillosa jornada de grandes pensadores y grandes ideas, invitar a la decana María Sándor para que dirija unas últimas palabras y que podamos cerrar esta instancia. Así que, decana, tiene el espacio.
Gracias, Gabriel. Yo me quedo sin palabras. Agradezco profundamente al profesor Frampton, a Alberto Follo por haber compartido esta amistad, ¿cierto? Y habernos abierto la posibilidad en este origen, como lo dijo Daniel Rudolph, estamos construyendo esta nueva facultad con una misión y una visión pertinente. Y qué más inspirador que las dos charlas que hemos tenido hoy día: civilización, cultura, naturaleza, origen, universal, regional. Yo me pregunto siempre qué es progreso. Creo que somos nosotros, los jóvenes, los profesores, este workshop que comienza mañana o comienza hoy día, los que tienen que redibujar un poquito la historia y hacerse preguntas y replantear, ¿no? Y ver por dónde es el camino. Si no parece todo tan oscuro. Simplemente entusiasmarlo. Creo que lo que viene es de una alegría total. Para nosotros el workshop de facultad es una gran fiesta de libertad, donde podemos expresarnos, podemos soñar, podemos volver al origen, ir al futuro. Y es ahí donde creo que surgen estas nuevas individualidades. Y yo tengo la esperanza de que sí vamos a ser capaces de reinventar y redibujar la historia. Así que nada, para mí es un sueño tenerlo, profesor Kenneth Frampton. Yo estudié con sus libros, así que es un honor total. Un abrazo a cada uno de ustedes. Felicidades, y mañana nos encontramos, ¿cierto? Y espero poder estar en todas las otras charlas y que nos acompañen. Muchas gracias. Buenas tardes, buenas noches. Desde la Araucanía profunda, azul.